Today's daf is daf Chaf Aleph. We're going to start now on Chaf Amid Beis, approximately 12 lines up from the bottom, Iboilahu. So the subject of our study today is Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, and specifically what's called Hesech Hadas, which will curtail and terminate the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim and require a new Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. And the Gemara spoke about, for example, a case where he did Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim at night because the Kohen was going to do the avodah of Hekter Chalavim Ve'varim at night. And the question is whether he needs another Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim in the morning. So Yiboilu, the Gemara now has the following suffix: Tuma Ma'u Shetoil LeKiddush Yadayim Raglayim. If the Kohen contracted Tuma after his Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, does he need a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim? Ma'u Shetoil means, shall we establish that the tumah that he contracted is now going to terminate his Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, and it require a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim if he wants to continue with the avodah. And the Gemara right now is of the opinion that we're talking about Tumas Yadayim. Now, what is the possibility that someone's hands could be contaminated, but the rest of his body is still pure, is still tahar? So that's called coming in contact with pigul or nosar. So imtim tzalom yitzia lo pasul. The Gemara had a suffix until now. What happens in a case where the Kohen, after the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, he left the environs of the Mikdash and he went chutz le'azara, let's say outside the azara. Imtim tzalom yitzia lo pasul. If we're going to assume that the fact that he left the azara does not discontinue his Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, it doesn't constitute a Hesech Hadas because he could always come back into the Azara. That's okay because the Gavra Chazi, because the person himself is not Tameh. He just right now is in the wrong location. He could just retrace his steps. Aval Hacha, but here in this case where his Yadayim became Tmeos, they contracted Tumah, Gavra Lo Chazi. Right now, there's nothing much he could do about it. He has to be Matar, he has to undergo a process of purification on his Yadayim, is Asuche Mesech Hadaite. Therefore, the Gemara in the first side thinks that we should push it in the direction of Hesech Hadas, and therefore require another Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. O Dilma, or should we say no? Kevon de Hadar Chazi, right now he's in a state in which he needs to be Matar's Yadayim, but he has within his power the ability to do so, is therefore dak le v'lo mesech hadaite. So right now he's going to make sure that he undergoes the proper tara, and he'll be very careful not to contract tumah again, and we can rely on his original Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. Toshma, let's bring a proof from the following brisa. It says Kiddush Yadav Raglav v'nitma'u. If after his Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim he contracted tumah, but v'nitmu seems to assume that his Yadayim became tmeos, is matbilon v'ein tzarich l'kaddish. All he needs is to be tovel his Yadayim in order to remove the state of tumah of Yadayim, and then he doesn't need a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So here's an explicit price that addresses your question, namely that tumas Yadayim does not in any way constitute a Hesech Hadas to generate a new chiyuv to do Kiddush Yadayim. So the Gemara says that you misunderstood my whole question. Nitmu Yadav lo mi boilon. I wasn't asking you about Nitmu Yadav. That for sure I understand is not a Hesech Hadas and lo toil. It doesn't require a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. Ki kam mi boilon, when I asked my question, Nitma kol gufo. I was asking a question about a case where his entire body became tummy. Let's say he came in contact with a corpse or with a sheretz. Kol gufo, the Gemara says, tepukle kevon de boil me'evid hariv shemesh asach hadaite. Wait a second. If his entire body contracted tumor, then he needs what's called Hariv Shemesh. It's not enough for him to dip himself into a mikvah. He has to wait until nightfall, and that's going to take a long time. And in the meantime, his mindset is not on the avoda, on the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. Then for sure he needs a new Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. So Gemara answers could go into Itmei Samach L'Shkiyas Achama. The question was in a scenario where he contracted tumor right before the end of the day, Samach L'Shkiyas Achama, before nightfall, before sunset, and therefore is a very short period of time until he achieves full tahara through Hariv Shemesh. The sun is about to set. And in that short period of time, the Gemara raises a possibility that he's not Mesech Hadas. He doesn't need another Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, Toshma. Now we're going to bring a brisa to try to answer this question from the laws of Sreifas HaPara, Para Aduma. And there's a case in which, in order to prepare himself for whatever avodah is necessary for the preparation of the paraduma, he has to do a kiddush, a process of sanctifying himself, so to speak. And Rabbi Chia Bar Rabbi Yossi Omar, according to their statement, Mekadesh B'Kli Sharis B'Fnim V'Yotze, this opinion is more mekil. This opinion is more machmir, and requires that the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim take place in the classic sense, which means inside the Azara, where the Kiyar is. And then after he does Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, he leaves the Azara, because the avoda of the Paradum is done b'chutz, outside the Azara, and he has already properly prepared himself by doing the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim b'fnim. But again, he requires a kli shares, meaning Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim in the classic context requires a kli shares, and it has to be done within the Azar, and that's exactly what Rabbi Chia requires. However, Rabbi Yochanan Omar, a disputing opinion, afilu bachutz. Paraduma is a different kind of avoda. It's not an avoda b'fnim, and therefore you don't need Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim b'fnim. But rather he can go out of the Azara, and he doesn't even need a kli shares. Afilu kli chol v'afilu b'mekida shel cheres. Right? Mekida is a kind of a pot that's used to fire up food. But the point is it's made of cheres. Cheres earthenware is something that's like low on the totem pole. It's not a kli choshev. So Rav Yochanan wants to say, he can find himself a cup that has that's made of earthenware, and he can wash his hands and his feet in the water in that cup. Because as far as paradum is concerned, that's all you need. And now we start today's daf. So we're on Chav Aleph. The Gemara says, V'hapara, if we know the laws of paraduma, then we know that it's muye mitaminale. Okay, so this has to do with the tztukim. We'll try to give a little background. As we know, the tztukim rejected the traditional transmission of the Torah Shebal Peh of the Chachamim. They rejected that, and they went by the book, meaning literally by Torah Shebechsav. And they came to the conclusion that for Sreifas HaPara, you need what's called Hariv Shemesh, meaning the Kohen who does the avodah of the paradum has to be completely tahar. Now, Lafuke, in order to make a public demonstration that we reject the tztukim and their position, what they did was they would purposely and deliberately be metami the Kohen, and then send him into the mikveh, and it was before Hariv Shemesh, and now he can go out and do the avodah. And that's a Mishnah in Masechta Parah that says, Metamim hayu HaKohen, the Kohen that was in charge of burning the paraduma after they slaughtered it. First, they would be metami him. They would deliberately cause him tuma. Let's say they would take a sheretz and put it on his body, and then matbilino. So he goes through tvila. He's not yet achieved hariv shemesh, so he's what's called a tvul yom, and he's kosher for sreifas hapara according to our tradition. Lahotzi milibon shel tzdukim sheyu omrim b'ma'urvei shemesh oisa nases. The tzdukim came to the conclusion, based on their understanding of the Torah itself in Bamidbar Perek Yutes, that's Parshas Chukas, the Parsha Paraduma, that it's always, the Torah repeats itself over and over again. It says V'tor, that he the Kohen who's serving and functioning to set up the Paraduma and the Tower of Paraduma is always Tar. And they understood Tar means that he has to have the same level of Tara as an Avodas Pnim, as Avoda of Karbonos in the Mikdash. Hence, he requires Hariv Shemesh. Shmamina, what do we learn from this? Right, the Kohen who did the Avoda of the Paraduma, it says that he would first be Metar Yodav, he would be Makadish Yodav Raglov. Now, where did he do that? That's the machlok between Reb Chia and Reb Yochanan. Let's say, according to Reb Chia, he underwent Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim in the classic sense before he did the avoda of chutz, of paraduma in the azara with a kli shares. And nevertheless, lo pasla ba tuma, even though he subsequently contracted tuma, and in this case, all we were going to require is that he get rid of his tumah, and he doesn't need a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, right? And he doesn't even need Hariv Shemesh, because we don't hold like the Tzdukim. We hold that a Tful Yom is kosher l'sreifas hapara. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that there's no need for a second round of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, because the Brisa seems to, the Mishnah, I should say, seems to indicate quite clearly that all we need is to be matvil him after they deliberately were matame him. You didn't even need Erev Shemesh, and certainly you didn't need another round, a new round of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So you see that even in a case where Nitma Kol Gufo, there's no Hesech Hadas, and therefore you don't need a second round of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, Shema Mino. So Gemara rejects it. Shiny para, hoil de tful yom lo posel be. In other words, it's really true that Tumas Haguf, if it was the whole guf, would certainly constitute a Hesech Hadas and disqualify the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim requiring a new Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. But here it's different, because we're talking about the avodas chutz of the paraduma. And in the case of avodas chutz of paraduma, we don't even need tara. We need a partial tara. He went to the mikveh, but not a full-fledged tara. He didn't have hariv shemesh. So therefore, we can lower our standards and be more lenient about the requirement of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. But in the case of avodas pnim, a classic avoda of the azara, for the karbanos, there, if the Kohen was Makadish Yodav Raglav and subsequently he contracted Tumas Haguf, Einochinami, he would need another round of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So the Gemara asks the following: Ihachi, if you're telling that Paraduma is matir, that we could be more makil with regard to Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, because the different kind of avoda is Lamali L'Kadish. Maybe we shouldn't even require Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. And not only that, according to Rav Chia Bar Yosef, we require a classic Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, as if he were doing the avoda bifnim of any carbon with a kli shares. Why do we require all that? Maybe avodas achutz doesn't even require Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So the Gemara says, Ke'ein avoda be'ina. Again, this is very complicated, because the Gemara is cutting down something that's neither, it's not light and it's not dark, it's not yes, it's not no, it's not 100%, it's right down the middle. But the avoda of paraduma is really right down the middle. It's not it's not just, Hefkervelt, do the avodah outside of the Mikdash and that's it. It is an avodah, but the Gemara calls it ke'ein avodah. It's similar to avodah. And it's similar enough to avodah to require some sort of a procedure of Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim, which according to Reb Chia is inside the Azara with the Klisharis, whereas according to Reb Yochanan, it's a whole new kind of Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim. And the bottom line is that we will require Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim of one sort or another for Avodas HaPara, but there going to be all sorts of leniencies with regard to that Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim, such that if the Kohen subsequently becomes Tomei, he just has to be Matar himself. He doesn't need Harav Shemesh, and he doesn't need another Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim. Iboilu, another suffix in the Gemara. Ma'u lekadesh yodov ragla bekiyar, meaning classic Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim requires taking the water out of the kiyar and pouring it on the hands and on the feet. Can we allow that the Kohen put his hands and his feet inside the kiyar, and that itself would qualify as Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim? Why? Because when the Torah requires Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim, it uses the word mimenu. It says v'rochatzu Aaron. This is at the end of Sefer Shmos. V'rochatzu Aaron ubanav mimenu, from it, es yedeim v'es ragleim, and therefore mimenu means that they take the water from the kiyar. Oh, dilma, we say afilu b'tocho. Although the Torah does use the word mimenu, because it's normally done in that way, but it doesn't matter. It's just the waters of the kiyar itself is what achieves the kiddush, the sanctification of his yadayim v'raglayim. So if he puts his hands and his feet inside the kiyar, that also will generate a sanctification. So we don't say that mimenu, according to the second sad, means that you turn the faucets and you draw the water from it, mimenu, from it, as opposed to immersing his hands and feet inside the kiyah. Okay. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Toshma, I have a proof from a brisa. Oshet taval b'mei ma'ora v'oved. The Kohen immersed himself into a ma'ora. A ma'ora is kind of like a cave, but in this case, some of the water flows into the cave. And then, after he was tovel in this ma'ora, he went ahead and he did the avodah, v'ovad. And the brisa says, avodah psula. Now, we disqualify his avodah because he's lacking some sort of process of preparation for his avodah. And the Gemara says that this scenario of mei ma'ora, of the water inside this cave or pit, has the same status as the water in the kiyar. Now, just 1 second, we have to look at one second. The question is as follows. Let's say he could do tefillah in this ma'ora. right? This cave has enough water, let's say 40 saw, and it qualifies as a tefillah. But he wants to kill excuse me, two birds with one stone. And he wants that tefillah to also serve at the same time as Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. That's what the Bryce says. It cannot serve as Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. And why not? Ha meikir dumya demei ma'ora v'avad avodaso kshera. Why don't we view the waters inside this pit as waters inside the kiyar? And if he had placed his hands inside the kiyar, that would not qualify as Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. To the same extent that the Brisa says that tefillah inside the Ma'ora is not valid, meaning it's only valid as tefillah, like a mikveh. So why was his avodah disqualified? It must be because although he immersed himself in a mikveh, he did not immerse himself in a way that could qualify as Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So Gemara says, lo, that's not a fair deduction. Mei ma'ara itzrichle. Shlo tomar kol gufo tovil behem. Yoda v'raglov lo kolshke. So Gemara now is playing the devil's advocate and claiming the following, that you want to determine from this brisa that the Mei Ma'ora have the same status as the Mei Kiyar. Meaning that the psul here that disqualifies his avoda is the same psul the psul is Mei Ma'ora. Mei Ma'ora is disqualified. Had it been right for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, and maybe that's because there was no separate Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. He wants to sort of ride the wave of Tvila. But had he done the exact same action, and if he would duplicate it in the kiyar itself, that would be valid. The only problem is that the Mei Kiyar, the Mei Ma'or is not Mei Kiyar. It's physically, it's not in the Kiyar. So we want to say the following, that had he performed an action on his Yadayim Raglayim in the Kiyar, which would be a duplication, exact duplication of what he did in the Ma'orah for Tefillah, then it would have been kosher. His avodah would be kosher. No, the Gemara says. What the Bryce wants to tell me is that what? Shelo Tomar kol gufo tovil behem. again, we have to know a little bit more about mikvos. There's something called mayim she'uvim, which is drawn water. So the water in the ma'ora is not mayim she'uvim. Nobody came along and put utensils under the water and then brought it over to the make. This is all natural, flowing water. Masha Ein Kain, in contrast, Mekiyar is mayim she'uvim, mayim that's drawn through pipes into the kiyar. So again, the Gemara is arguing now that it could very well be that if the Kohen does the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim inside the kiyar, that would not be valid. You were telling me that the reason why Mema Ora could not substitute for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim is because he didn't do a separate action of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. No. I'm going to tell you that if he duplicated the tvila in a Mei Mora in the case of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim and a Kiyar, that would not be valid. And that's why this brisa goes out of its way to point out Mei Ma'ora, because we would have thought that if Mei Ma'ora serve as a functioning, valid mikvah for tvila and could be matayr his entire goof, then the sanctification of Kiddush, which is only on Yadayim for Gleim, only a segment of it was because Kolshkein, it should be fine if he had done it in that same way, putting his hands in. Kamash will know that his avoda is psula because there was no Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, and even had he put his hands and his feet inside the kiyar, it would be possible. Rab Chia bar Yosef, Mei kiyar nifsalin l'matirin kimatirin. Okay, we're talking about Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim before nightfall. How does it impact on the day's avoda, the following morning? So Reb Chia bar Yosef says that we should compare matirim to matirim. Now, in the avodas hakorbanos, what avoda can we identify, specify that is matir the achilas habasar? That's going to be the avodas hadam, or alternatively the kmitza in the case of a korban mincha. Now, if the dam or the komets would be left over beyond this allotted time, let's say one more day until sundown of the second day, then the korban becomes possible. Comes on Reb Chia bar Yosef and he says that the mayim in the Mei Kiyar has the same laws as do the korbanos. And therefore, the Kohen who performs avoda with dam, meaning zrikas hadam, or kmitza in the case of komets, he has to do kiddush yadayim raglayim with the mayim, right? Let's go over. Again, this is, we're trying to do two dafim in one daf, but the daf before this, which is daf Chaf, had established that in order to avoid what's called a psulina, they had to submerge the kiyar overnight in a mikveh. It had to be immersed in a mikveh, which is called a bar. If the kiyar was not immersed in that bar before nightfall, then the mayim in the kiyar become possible for kiddush yadayim raglayim. And leivarim keivarim, just like the avarim of a carbon, have to remain on the mizbeach for the entire night, and if daybreak happens and that disqualifies the basar carbon, the avari carbon for hektar avarim, so too says Reb Chia bar Ava, the kiyar, the waters of the kiyar become possible with daybreak, and you can't use it for kiddush yadayim raglayim. And if the Kohen wants to do the hektar chalavim, then just like in the case of the chalavim, they can't be left overnight, so too in the case of the kiyar, the mei kiyar cannot be left overnight. And therefore, if they were left overnight without being immersed, as we said before, in a mikvah, then you need a new kiddush yadayim raglayim. The kiddush yadayim raglayim is disqualified. Again, that would only be if the Kohen wants to perform the avodas hadam, or in the case of mincha, avodas hakometz. But if all the Kohen is going to do is he's going to be makti the chalavim and the avarim on the mizbeach, then the fact that during the course of the night the mei kiyar were not submerged in the mikveh, that would not be a problem, because avarim kevarim, and therefore it would be a problem only if at the time of daybreak, when the day began, the mayim were puzzled because they weren't submerged in a mikveh. That's one opinion. Then we have Rav Chizda Amar, Afla matir ne'enif solim el bamud hashachar. Right, he holds that the mei kiyar for kiddush yadayim raglayim do not have to be submerged overnight. Ke'evarim. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, kiyar kevon sheshiko shuv ein maleu. So Rav Chizda is mekil vis-a-vis Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, and he holds that the psul of mei kiyar will only apply at daybreak, and therefore, if you immerse the mei kiyar at shkia, the waters in the mei kiyar remain kosher l'kiddush yadayim raglayim for any avoda, But if, on the other hand, the Mekir were immersed at daybreak, then the Mayim becomes possible for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim for any avoda. So therefore, according to Rav Chizda, the Mekir would be immersed for the entire night, and then they would not have to be immersed during the current night as long as they were immersed shortly before daybreak. And then with daybreak, the Mayim become fit and kosher for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim for the entire day. However, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we want to have the kiyar submerged even before sundown, because we want the mayim and the kiyar to be kosher and prepared for the avoda of the dam or for the avoda of hekter chalav ve'ra. So then Rabbi Yochanan is the most machmir of all these three shitas. But the Gemara is going to reject this. L'meimra the avodas laila nami l'chazi. Is it true that according to Rabbi Yochanan, the meikir will not be kosher even for the avoda that it was done during the night of hekter chalav ve'varim, if the meikir were not submerged at sundown? For Omar, that contradicts another statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Asi Omar Rabbi Yochanan b'shmei de ilfa. Kiyar shaloshiko miba'erev, even if the kiyar was not immersed in the bar during the evening, mekadosh mimenu lavodas laila. Nevertheless, that's okay. It's still kosher for kiddush yadayim raglayim for the avodas laila u'lemocher and mekadosh. So Rabbi Yochanan is outspoken about the fact that the kiyar, even though it was not immersed during the night, it could still be used for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim for the Avodas Laila. And that's against Rabbi Yochanan that we just quoted before. So the Gemara reinterprets, my Eino Maleu. We go back to Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, Kiyar Kevan Sheshiko Shuv Eino Malehu. Nami de Ka'omer Lavodas Yom, that it's important, it's critical that the kiyar be immersed in the bar carrying over to daybreak, so that now the mei kiyar are kosher for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim for the Avodas Hayom. Aval Avodas Laila Chaz. Even if the kiyar was not submerged in the bar during the course of the night, nevertheless the mei kiyar are kosher for the avodas laila. So Gemara says, "Hachi hainu to Rabbi Chia bar Yosef." We go back to Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, who made that distinction between the requirement of immersion at night and the requirement of immersion during the day after daybreak. So what is Rabbi Yochanan just repeating what we know from Rabbi Chia? And why did he have to repeat it?